Welcome to this tutorial for Civilization's first alternative mode, the Quad VCO. This firmware update turns Civilization into 4 independent, high-quality virtual analog oscillators with pulse width modulation, detuned waveforms, chord mode, sub-oscillators, LFO modulation and more. For anyone not familiar with Civilization, it is a digital multi-purpose Eurorack module with 4 standard modes: Matrix Mixer, Sequential Switch, Quad Mu Coder, and Quadraphonic Panner. There is a playlist on our YouTube channel with in-depth videos covering Civilization and its 4 standard modes. You'll find the link in the video description. The new Quad VCO mode is a free firmware upgrade for all Civilization owners. It can replace any of the 4 standard modes. Simply pick the mode you use the least and install Quad VCO in its place. This does not permanently override the original mode. You can undo this change at any time, install Quad VCO in a different slot, or revert Civilization to its original factory configuration. First, let's look at how to install the Quad VCO firmware. We already have a firmware installation tutorial on our YouTube channel. It still covers the basic process, but for the latest details, use the current instructions included with the firmware download. Go to yuhi.com, open the Civilization product page and click Download latest firmware. Then follow the instructions in the supplied PDF file. This is how we activate an alternative mode. Go to this URL and use our CVZ ini generator. This tool lets you choose which standard mode should be replaced by the Quad VCO. It also lets you tweak some of Civilization's additional settings. Click Generate to download the resulting cvz.ini file. Copy it to the microSD card, then insert the card back into Civilization. Before you begin, please beware. Changing the mode configuration in the cvz.ini file will reset Civilization's internal preset memory. That's unfortunate but necessary. By the way, you can later edit this cvz.ini file directly on Civilization's microSD card. Page 43 of the user guide explains this process in detail. Now let's fire up that new Quad VCO mode. In my case, Quad VCO is mode 3. Your module might look different here depending on which mode slot you chose to replace. We are now on the top page of the Quad VCO. As usual, we call this the performance page. First, let's look at the signal flow. The 4 main input jacks are pitch CV inputs, 1 for each oscillator. The inputs are normaled from left to right, so for example, if only input 1 is connected, that pitch CV is also sent to oscillators 2, 3 and 4. If I plug this into input 3, then input 3 and 4 would get this CV signal and 1 and 2 would be up to you what to do with it. So let's put that back into input 1. Now we would get 4 identical pitches into all 4 oscillators. A small amount of automatic detune is added to normaled inputs for a more vintage feel. If you don't want that, split or multiply your pitch CV outside of Civilization and patch it into all 4 inputs separately. Outputs 1 to 4 carry the individual oscillator audio signals. CVA and CVB are control inputs that can take care of pitch bend, modulation and other tasks. Now let's look at the encoders. Each horizontal row represents 1 oscillator. By default, each oscillator is a member of a group designated by color: orange, green, blue and magenta. The left-hand encoder assigns each oscillator to one of these colors. If all you want is 4 independent VCOs, just stick with the default configuration. However, you can assign multiple oscillators to the same color if you want them to share the same waveform, tuning, quantizer, glide, and modulation settings. The right-hand encoder sets the base octave for the group assigned to that oscillator. up to 3 octaves up or 3 octaves down. I'll reset them, you see a brief flash, and that's when you know you are back to the default octave. On a tangent, since Civilization's outputs are DC coupled, the Quad VCO can also double as an LFO source. Feed it a sufficiently negative pitch CV and the oscillator will slow down well into sub-audio territory. To enter a group's parameter page, press the corresponding left-hand encoder. Here we can adjust the main parameters for the orange oscillator group. The first left-hand encoder selects the waveform. Turn it all the way left for triangle. By the way, we are listening to the raw, unfiltered, unaffected sound of the oscillators here, across 8 octaves. Before we go through the other waveforms, let's look at the rest of this page. The second left-hand encoder controls the modifier depth. What the modifier does depends on the selected waveform. With the first 3 waveforms, it adds vibrato. With other waveforms, it might control pulse width, detune, spread or chord type. The third left-hand encoder adds a sub-oscillator, a square wave 1 octave below the main oscillator. The fourth left-hand encoder sets the LFO rate. So let me crank up the vibrato so you can hear it. The LFO runs from very slow movement to fast modulation. And its waveform is fixed at triangle. Let's pause that sequence for a moment. On the right, the first encoder sets the bass octave. This is the same octave parameter we already saw on the performance page. The second encoder adds or subtracts up to 12 semitones. The third encoder fine-tunes the group by up to 100 cents in either direction. I'm not going for the full range here. Just showing you the functionality. Okay, the flash indicates that we're back to 0. So we've got the sequence back. Now for the fourth parameter. This sets the glide time, also known as portamento. The brighter the LED, the longer the glide. CVA can also control parameters such as vibrato depth, modifier depth, glide time or LFO rate. We'll set that up in the next section. Now let's try the other available waveforms. Starting with triangle, let's turn the top left encoder 1 tick to the right. Here we get a sawtooth with vibrato. Next is a pulse wave with 50% duty cycle, effectively a square wave, also with vibrato. Then we get a pulse wave with fixed pulse width, set by the modifier depth. Since the modifier depth can also be modulated via CVA, this is how we can control pulse width with external sources. The next pulse wave uses the internal LFO for pulse width modulation. After that, animated saw gives us 2 detuned sawtooth waves with adjustable detune. Next, saw stack gives us an ensemble of 7 sawtooth waves. Use the modifier depth to spread them apart. So let me pause the sequence. For the last mode, chord saw gives us selectable chords, octaves, fifth, minor, major, sus, seventh, ninth, and diminished. That's it. Press any encoder to return to the performance page. From here, long press any left-hand encoder to enter the config page for that oscillators group. This may look familiar from the config pages in the standard civilization modes, but in Quad VCO, each oscillator group has its own config page. The left-hand encoders are for orientation only. The actual settings are adjusted with the right-hand encoders. The first right-hand encoder sets the quantization scale: off, chromatic, major, different minor scales, blues, diminished, and alien alloy. The second right-hand encoder sets the CVA function. This determines what the CVA input controls for this oscillator group: vibrato depth, modifier depth, glide time, or LFO rate. The third encoder sets the CVB function. CVB can be used for pitch bend with different ranges, 1 volt per octave pitch bend, chromatic transposition after the quantizer, or sample track and hold. The fourth right-hand encoder sets the tracking time for the sample track and hold processor. Each tick equals 1 millisecond, up to a maximum of 10 milliseconds. This can help if the sample and hold grabs the pitch CV slightly too early, for instance before a sequencer or keyboard CV has fully settled. Note that tracking time only matters in Quad VCO when CVB is set to sample track and hold. If CVB is doing something else, tracking time has no effect here. Before continuing with some example patches, let me remind you that Civilization lets you save up to 7 user presets encompassing all VCO settings and tunings. These presets can be recalled seamlessly, so there is no interruption in the audio output. Very handy for live situations. Okay, now let's look at a few example patches for the Quad VCO mode. The obvious starting point is to treat the 4 oscillators as 4 separate voices. Each VCO gets its own pitch CV source and each output goes wherever you want it to go. But you can also combine them in different ways. For instance, you can build 2 duophonic voices. Or a quad polyphonic patch. Or a 3-voice polyphonic patch plus 1 separate monophonic voice. So yes, it's quite versatile. As mentioned earlier, the VCOs can also go down into LFO territory if you feed them a negative pitch CV. Here is the orange VCO routed through our melt filter. Now we're going to use the green VCO's triangle wave tuned down with a negative pitch CV to modulate the filter cutoff. So now let's select different waveforms. Can dial in the sub-oscillator. And since this is no ordinary LFO, we can get some unusual modulation contours from the waveforms and chord modes and detuned waves. Next, let's try some CV modulation. Here is the pulse wave with fixed pulse width, and I'm going to assign CVA to modifier depth. And here is a unipolar ramp LFO plugged into CVA, modulating pulse width. Okay, so let's switch that LFO for a stepped random voltage. Yeah, pretty cool. Now let's change that waveform to chord saw. Here's a very simple sequence using static chords. With CVA still assigned to modifier depth, we can now use a CV sequence to switch between chord types. Finally, with VCO1 set to triangle, let's assign CVB to pitch bend with 1 volt per octave and patch the second VCO, also in triangle mode, into the CVB input. Okay. Now let's tune the second VCO down until we hear the modulation take effect. There's a limit to the frequency that CVB can process. So this is not an anything goes audio rate FM. Tuning the modulator VCO up can also yield strange effects and erratic results. So you get a pitch modulation patch where carrier and modulator can both track the same pitch CV. Nicely unstable and very modular. So much for the quad VCO. Have fun exploring this new firmware mode. Subscribe to our newsletter and never miss out on any future upgrade to Civilization.